Vanuatu, Fiji, December 2020.
Cyclone Yasa was a Category 5 monster in the Southern Hemisphere during the 2020-2021 cyclone season. It started north of Port Vila in Vanuatu before eventually tracking southeast, doing a small little loop, and as it completed that loop, it started to intensify. First it got cyclone status, Category 1 equivalent, and then it just kept going. When I personally first received news that it had reached Category 5 status, I was out in a local town near where I live, visiting Nathan for the first time, and God, what a night that was. I'm not getting sidetracked by that, but obviously as I get home, I forget what time it was. I rush onto my computer, call with the team going, what the heck? Why is this a Category 5 and why am I not available during the most important hours?
Yasa was a devastating storm for the areas that it affected. I guess the one good thing that can be taken away from this is that it didn't affect the most populated parts of the Fijian islands, but it still reached Vanuatu as a strong Category 4 storm by the time it made landfall. It peaked, of course, as a Category 5 with winds of 165 miles per hour and a pressure of 912 millibars. It caused $247 million in damages and damaged at least 6,000 buildings, destroying 2,000. 23,000 also evacuated from the storm. After the end of a very incredible season in the Northern Hemisphere, in the Atlantic particularly, Yasa kept the thing going into December, and another system on that big list of 2020 cyclones. What an incredible year that was. Yasa at number 60 on my top 100. Bagao, Philippines, July 1986. A tropical disturbance developed in the far eastern part of the Western Pacific, not far from the international date line, and ended up being a wave for a few days before beginning to develop in the first days of July. Becoming a tropical storm as it headed towards the Mariana Islands, it became Tropical Storm Peggy and then became a strong typhoon, ramping up in intensity and peaking as a 175 mile per hour Category 5. Weakening a little bit before reaching northern Luzon, it was still a powerful typhoon by the time it arrived, and then it continued northwestwards and slammed into southeastern China near Shanwei, and then moved inland and then towards the west. The storm was very damaging for both countries, more for China than the Philippines at around a 2-to-1 ratio. There were 431 fatalities in total from this storm, and unfortunately not many images of what the storm actually did. $503 million in damages, 113,000 buildings damaged, and 293,000 destroyed, which really tells you a lot about how far-reaching the effects of this storm was, particularly in China. In addition, 1,940 were injured by this storm, and it reportedly produced a storm surge of 6 feet around about the time it made landfall, although that may have been higher. With a pressure estimate of 896 millibars at peak, it certainly has intensity stacked up in its favour, and of course its damages were quite tremendous even though it weakened before it made landfall. That's Typhoon Peggy, number 59 in my top 100. Port Vila, Vanuatu, March 2015, Cyclone Pam.
One of the most intense Southern Hemisphere systems that we've seen based off satellite appearance. The storm was nuts in terms of how it looked on satellite imagery. I believe at peak intensity it had a complete ring of minus 80 degrees. Now that's not too uncommon for a Southern Hemisphere system, especially in the most favourable months in the South Pacific where Pam was. It's just its time spent just barreling through Vanuatu at such an intensity. I believe it made its first of many landfalls on Erromango as a 175 mile per hour system officially. However, I think it could have been stronger than that considering the absolute insane damage that was seen there, but I do digress. If you're just going off satellite imagery, Pam could be one of the most beautiful storms. Its CDO, as it was forming, was just insane. It was holding minus 90 degree cloud tops for, I believe it was close to 2 days at one point. It was just holding them, and it was kind of a slow burner situation where it would be focusing on the organization of the structure of the storm before it really went boom and, well, rapidly, borderline explosively intensified before blasting through Vanuatu, where it likely made multiple landfalls at or above, well above the baseline Category 5 intensity, that's for sure. I believe the strongest was on Erromango with winds of 175 miles per hour. Could it have been stronger than that? Well, the cloud tops and Dvorak analysis of the storm certainly suggest that. The storm would have been at least a T7.5 on the Dvorak, which would be 175 or above. And the storm just absolutely exquisite on satellite imagery. One small caveat of that was, I guess with most Southern Hemisphere systems, the eye didn't perfectly round itself out, but I don't think that probably held back the eye wall from being an absolute phenomenal beast.
Pam was responsible for extensive damage, with 20,000 buildings sustaining some kind of impact and 1,000 destroyed completely. 16 people were killed by the storm, and it cost $250 million in damages at least, if not more. Pam peaked with winds of 175 miles per hour and an estimated pressure of 896 millibars, one of the most intense storms in the basin. Force 13 also covered the storm in its early days as a team. You're watching Update 5 on Cyclone Pam, the second strongest storm ever recorded in the South Pacific Ocean. Its winds are 165 miles per hour. Its pressure is 899 millibars. Pam is number 58 in my top 100. Tokushima, Japan. September 1976. In the final days of August, a tropical wave was moving along the low latitudes, well in the eastern part of the Western Pacific, and eventually developed into a tropical cyclone. But it wasn't until around about the 3rd or 4th day of September that it actually happened, becoming a tropical depression and then named Tropical Storm Fran. It moved past Guam with relative ease, gradually strengthening and then rapidly in the Philippine Sea, moving northwestwards, and became a strong Category 4 typhoon for a while, approaching the Ryukyu Islands and passing in between Okinawa and Amami. Continuing northwards and stalling for a little bit actually, just northwest of the Amami Islands, the storm eventually moved northwards again, made landfall in western Kyushu as a minimal typhoon, and continued northeastwards where it became a remnant low of extratropical nature. Well, Fran, despite its alongside its Category 4 peak, 155 mile per hour winds and a pressure of 910 millibars, this storm was catastrophic in terms of the amount of rainfall it produced, which caused landslides and serious flooding issues over wide expanses of the Japanese islands. The storm killed 169, damaged 442,000 buildings, and destroyed 11,000. 435 were also injured by the storm. Additionally, damages in monetary values totaled $660 million. But I think the real standout statistic from this storm is that in Tokushima, the area that we looked at on the beginning of that video, the rainfall amount there was astronomical, up to 2,700 millimeters of rain, which is nearly 110 inches. An extraordinary rainfall total from this storm in that location, and that was on the eastern side of Shikoku, nowhere near where the center of the storm tracked. Fran, a fascinating storm to look at, number 57 on my top 100. Punta Gorda, Florida. August 2004. A tropical wave left Africa in the first days of August and continued across the Atlantic, a rather broad wave which had only little bits of convection generally throughout its passage, but its convection ramped up as it neared the Caribbean Sea, and it eventually got its act together and became a tropical depression and then Tropical Storm Charlie. It continued through the Caribbean Sea, a rather small storm at this point, and became a hurricane, intensified a lot as it reached the western coast of Cuba, and a small storm as it approached Florida, rapidly intensified to a Category 4 and made landfall, of course, in the southwest of Florida. This storm was not only surprising, but it was very strong, particularly near its very tight core. Charlie, a classical example of a pinhole eye with a very small storm size when you look at the satellite pictures. When it made landfall in Florida, they were expecting it would actually be moving further north, that it would end up reaching the Tampa Bay area by the time it made landfall. But the forecast ended up trending south, and it was the Punta Gorda area and Port Charlotte and the Fort Myers region that copped the worst of this storm, and it turned out to be an extremely damaging one. It was the second costliest US hurricane at the time, causing $16.9 billion in damages. 35 were killed by the storm as well. The storm peaked with winds of 150 miles per hour and a pressure of 943 millibars. It also caused 147,000 buildings to be damaged and 2,400 destroyed. Also to point out, a large evacuation, not the largest of the year though, 1.7 million evacuated from the storm, and it produced over 10 inches of rain. It also came with a 13-foot storm surge. Most of these statistics would be beaten by another storm 18 years later, and I think we all know what storm that is. But this was Hurricane Charlie, still will be well remembered. Although it was overshadowed by one or two stronger storms that year, it still ranks at number 56 on my top 100. Wilmington, North Carolina, September 1999.
Hurricane Floyd would help bookend the 1990s decade, being the third hurricane out of the 1999 hurricane season, specifically the third Category 4 storm of that year, also being a Category 4 with the likes of Lenny and Gert. Floyd would start out in the main development region right around September 2nd, 8 days before the peak of the season, would drift across the main development region right by the Lesser Antilles and would start to intensify by about September 7th. Lenny then would graze the Lesser Antilles and become a hurricane traversing north of the Turks and Caicos, and then would go from a Category 3 rapidly intensifying into a borderline Category 5 with winds of 155 miles per hour. Floyd would go on to impact the Bahamas, bringing heavy rains and storm surge to that area. It would go through an annual replacement cycle shortly after getting through the Bahamas, bringing it down to Category 3, but it would intensify back to a Category 4, making landfall near Cape Fear, North Carolina, right around September 11th and 12th, and would bring some devastating impacts to that area.
Floyd's fury was first felt in the Bahamas, ravaged on Tuesday night. By daybreak, winds and rain leave power lines down, homes flattened, and a freighter pushed ashore. Florida and Georgia are spared the worst, but there is some destruction, massive power outages, and building damage, but no loss of life. In Jacksonville, Florida, part of this pier collapses into the ocean.
As for damage, well, earlier today, the storm swept away a historic pier in Daytona Beach, Florida.
It's not a matter of if, it's now down to when. Hurricane Floyd is coming our way, and the Triangle could see some of the worst flooding yet. Floyd has so far brushed the southeast, but now it has its sights set inland.
In total, a remarkable 1 million Floridians evacuated from the storm, which never really hit that area, and another 1.8 million across the Carolinas and Georgia.
A whole new round of evacuations begin in North Carolina. Thousands are caught in traffic jams trying to leave Wilmington.
Historically, 9 out of 10 people killed in hurricanes are killed by storm surge on the immediate coast. People on the immediate coast need to heed the advice of local officials and especially those evacuation orders.
On shore, heavy rains. Anywhere from 6 to 12 inches are expected in the storm's path, 3 to 6 inches further inland. Already there is flooding. In some areas, the storm surge could measure 11 feet.
This is about how high it got during Fran, but that was when Fran was almost over. This hasn't even started yet, and the water's already up this high.
Well, this place is lower than sea level, so we always get flooded for every hurricane to happen. So we're packing up for good this time and going back to Raleigh.
Well, this is big. We haven't had anything like this in a long time, and I think everyone is pretty well prepared. You board up, you leave, don't put yourself, you can always build another building, but you lose your life, that's it.
I stayed here through Emily, and it's not a situation that I'd like for my daughters to have to go through, but I would rather take my chances here than be stranded in traffic or on the road when it sets in. So we decided to stick it out.
When everything you have's here, be here and take care of it. It's probably a whole lot worse to be somewhere else and worrying about it than being here and taking care of it as it happens.
Hurricane Floyd is pummeling 200 miles of the Carolina coast tonight. This is the southern edge of the storm, Folly Beach, South Carolina. In the Carolinas, debris litters streets and trees are down, but daylight will reveal whether this colossal storm has done devastating damage.
The maximum wind gust in Florida got up to 69 miles per hour, and generally the rainfall reached around 2 or 3 inches. South Carolina got persistent winds.
Living through one, I saw what it could do. I spent some time down in Homestead after the hurricane, and it put a real fear in my heart. We just bought a house, and I just don't feel too comfortable about staying in it tonight. So we figured better safe than sorry. Even if the house survives, that's not an issue, just as long as we're safe.
If it gets as bad as they say it is, the winds, I don't want to be out in this, but this is all I've got. It's my car right now, I hate to lose it. If it's going to go, I'd like to be with it.
The storm moved in at around midnight as a Category 2 hurricane, causing substantial damage and particularly surge impacts along the coast. Trees were downed and some tornadoes were also reported. And then the flooding started to take hold.
North Carolina would be the heaviest hit with 51 deaths in and around that area. Would cause economic impacts, predominantly a lot of the rivers, experiencing 1 in 500 year flooding all across the eastern part of the state. Also causing a lot of ecological impacts where a lot of the runoff in and around the farmland would end up in the waters of the rivers due to Floyd.
9 o'clock, 3 hours before high tide and projected landfall, Hurricane Floyd takes an abrupt right turn away from Myrtle Beach. Winds hit 75 miles per hour, and some transformers blow, lighting the sky an eerie green. But the hurricane brushes Myrtle with a glancing blow, not a direct hit.
This is what it looked like on the streets of Wilmington during this long, long night. Hour after hour of wind and heavy, heavy rain. And finally, the inevitable. Power everywhere flickered and then went off.
The eastern part of North Carolina suffered the worst from the storm's flooding. The Tar River exceeded 500-year flood levels, cresting 24 feet above flood stage. Rocky Mount was flooded, 30% underwater for several days. In Tarboro, much of downtown was under several feet of water. The town of Princeville was largely destroyed when the waters of the Tar poured over the town's levee, covering the town with over 20 feet of floodwater for 10 days. Greenville also suffered heavy flooding, and damages in Pitt County were estimated at $1.6 billion. Washington was also hit very hard, but Wilmington, despite getting the highest amount of rainfall from the storm, was spared the worst flooding due to the storm's track. Heavy rainfall and flooding continued into Virginia, where there was $101 million in damages, and some areas reached 16 inches of rainfall. Floyd's rain bands then swept through the mid-Atlantic, causing substantial rainfall in many other locations. In Maryland, 12.5 inches, Washington DC getting strong wind gusts of up to 56 miles per hour, and 12 inches of rain in Delaware. New Jersey reported 14 inches of rain, and in Pennsylvania, drownings and fallen trees killed 13 and injured 40. Flooding continued into New York, with 12 inches of rain seen in Cairo.
Floyd hasn't bothered me at all, and actually my friends in Florida still have a house, which I'm very happy about. All of them, so they're fine. I live in New Jersey, and I want to see if I have windows.
And I know in our office and most of the offices around the city, they told everybody to go home around 3 o'clock.
11 inches of rain fell in Connecticut, whilst in Massachusetts, wind gusts reached 76 miles per hour. The storm's rainfall started to decrease as it continued further north and lost energy as it entered Atlantic Canada, with maximum rainfall there nearly 5 inches, but winds reached 73 miles per hour in various places in Atlantic Canada. An extraordinary storm with a beautiful appearance near its peak, nearly at Category 5 status. That's one of the big debates that's going on in the weather community, but I think it is just about on the side of Category 4 rather than 5 at its peak intensity. It was a fairly short peak as well, which I suppose lends a little bit more credence to that. But nonetheless, Floyd, an impressive storm and one to be remembered, lots of visuals on it, and that is number 55 on my top 100. Wenzhou, China, September 1989. Probably the most underrated tropical cyclone in history, became Tropical Storm Vera in the middle of September 1989 and gradually intensified, getting close to typhoon status for a while and then reaching typhoon status as it made landfall along the eastern coast of China near Wenzhou. It then moved inland, not very far, and then turned post-tropical as it shot off back towards Japan and eventually towards the international dateline. Why is this storm so far underestimated? It was a small storm, it didn't look like it did very much on satellite imagery, and it wasn't the strongest storm ever. So what happened? Well, rainfall from this storm triggered so much destruction and an enormous amount of damage in eastern China. Quite how, even I'm not sure. But the storm peaked as a typhoon with 75 mph winds and a pressure of 980 millibars. It killed 550, but what's more is this storm is the most damaging storm in the world with regards to buildings damaged or destroyed. 2.7 million damaged buildings and 3.1 million destroyed. Additionally, 2,600 were injured by the storm and $351 million of damages was reported. It's astounding that 5.8 million buildings were damaged or destroyed by this storm, and I'm inclined to take that as it comes, as an actual truth, considering the amount of fatalities that occurred from such a apparently weak storm. I guess, if nothing else, this shows us that the power in even the weaker storms can be very surprising indeed. Typhoon Vera, number 54 on my top 100. Choshan, China, August 1956. A tropical disturbance was first sighted over the Mariana Islands, moving northeastwards, becoming a tropical cyclone as it rounded towards the west and became Typhoon Wanda, strengthening rapidly and reaching a very powerful Category 5 peak with winds of 185 miles per hour. It then continued west-northwestwards through Miyakojima and then towards the east coast of China, where it made a landfall, an extremely powerful landfall, as a Category 4 storm with winds of 150 miles per hour. It then moved inland and caused substantial damage to the region. It packed a 16-foot storm surge when it made landfall in Zhejiang province, and it damaged 2.2 million buildings, destroying 38,000. The death toll was even worse, 5,700 killed by this storm, and 16,000 injured. An incredible toll from this storm, and probably one of the deadliest storms in Chinese history. Peaking with a pressure of 905 millibars, Wanda was the most intense and strongest storm of that season in 1956, and a radar image of the storm survives when it was nearing landfall. Wanda, number 53 in my top 100. Yangon, Myanmar, May 2008. A tropical disturbance developed in the Andaman Sea and entered the Bay of Bengal, eventually becoming Tropical Cyclone Nargis. The storm curved towards the north and then stalled for a little bit, and then started moving again northeastwards as it gained Hurricane Force status, and then intensified further as it approached the coast of Myanmar, peaking as a Category 4 storm and making landfall there as 130 mph Category 4. It then curved inland towards the northeast and died off well inland. Nargis was an incredible storm in the damage that it caused. It made landfall in the Ayeyarwady region of Myanmar, causing substantial damage to some of the towns there. Around 75% of buildings were destroyed. In total, though, the storm was most notable for its death toll. Potentially 146,000 killed by this storm, which is probably the largest amount in very modern times. It also caused $10 billion in damages, damaged 250,000 buildings, and destroyed another 250,000. This storm is certainly one to be remembered in the North Indian Ocean as to being one of the most recent enormous casualty of over 100,000 event in cyclone history. Nargis at number 52 on my top 100. Chetumal, Mexico, September 1955. A tropical storm developed in the main region of the Atlantic and became Hurricane Janet, weakening to a tropical storm for a little while in the eastern Caribbean before getting its wings again and strengthening further as it continued into the western Caribbean and eventually slammed the Yucatan Peninsula as a very strong Category 5 storm into the Bay of Campeche and then making landfall near Tampico as a Category 1 or 2. Janet was a very strong storm by the time it made landfall on the Yucatan. Chetumal and Corozal on the other side of the border in British Honduras, as it was known at the time, were decimated by this storm. It was reported that only 4 buildings were left standing in Chetumal, and that Janet really unleashed its fury in those areas. Our estimate for the storm has the maximum winds of 175 miles per hour and a pressure of 908 millibars, which occurred just before it made landfall. Janet was an extremely destructive storm. It damaged at least 20,000 buildings and destroyed another 20,000, but its death toll was also a fairly high one at 1,023. The storm's monetary damages totaled 66 million, although that's probably very much an underestimate, and it was probably higher than that.
These pictures of the aftermath of Hurricane Janet were taken from a US Navy helicopter flying on a rescue mission over Mexico. Large areas of British Honduras and the Yucatan Peninsula were inundated, while the Mexican oil port of Tampico was almost completely underwater.
Famine, desolation and disaster are all that remain in Tampico, Mexico, after Hurricane Janet has roared in from the sea. Swollen by the torrential rains, rivers have burst their banks and turned the big coastal city into a vast lake, where each flooded home marks a family tragedy.
That's Hurricane Janet from 1955 at number 51 on my top 100. Guayama, Puerto Rico, August 1899. A tropical storm formed in the open Atlantic and ventured towards the Lesser Antilles, gradually intensifying and becoming a hurricane before arriving there as it sailed across the open waters of the Atlantic. Reaching Category 4 status as it moved through Guadeloupe and then on towards Puerto Rico, making another Category 4 landfall, peaking with winds of 150 miles per hour. It then cruised through the Bahamas, glancing Hispaniola, and continuing on near the coast of Florida, still as a Category 3 storm, an intensity that it held for quite some time as the days ticked along. It then started to recurve and was still at a reachable distance off the US East Coast, and then it started to venture back in towards the Outer Banks, stalling a little bit in that area, weakening, and then turning back northeastwards, back out over the Atlantic. It gave a miss to the New England area and then continued eastwards, turning post-tropical. But that was not it for this storm. It ended up becoming one of the longest-lived tropical cyclones in history, and certainly the longest Atlantic storm if you count the extratropical gap, becoming a tropical storm again on August 26th and starting to move northwards. By this point, it was in the open North Atlantic and was slowly getting closer to the Azores. It started to turn eastwards and then southeastwards and then intensified again and was on its way towards hurricane status when it was approaching the Azores, which it achieved on September the 3rd. It then dived through the Azores and then moved northeastwards, turning post-tropical for good this time on September the 4th. An extremely long-lived storm, as you saw there, and a very long track as well. Montserrat was very impacted by this storm, with nearly every building destroyed and 100 deaths reported. In Guadeloupe, the storm unroofed and flooded many houses. In St. Kitts, at least 200 buildings were destroyed, and almost all were destroyed on St. Croix. But Puerto Rico was the worst impacted area for this storm, and that's why we chose Guayama as the featured location at the beginning of our feature. And the storm caused around $20 million in damages. It was one of the worst storms Puerto Rico had seen in its history, and it caused at least 3,000 fatalities. Storm surge was the chief impact for the eastern coast of North Carolina, the Outer Banks. In all, the storm caused 4,039 fatalities, 30,000 buildings damaged, and 21,000 destroyed. Additionally, 1,400 people were injured by this storm. Number 50 in my top 100. Matsusaka, Japan, September 1953. A tropical depression formed and became Tropical Storm Tess as it passed close to Guam and then continued into the Philippine Sea, eventually becoming a typhoon and then explosively intensifying on September 21st to become a Category 5 by the time we got into the 22nd. The storm then weakened almost as quickly, quite quick weakening, and then continued towards the coast of Japan, making landfall on the Mie Peninsula and then moving northeastwards inland over Honshu and then off towards the northeast, passing through the Kuril Islands and then on towards the Kamchatka Peninsula and dying off. Tess was a very powerful storm at peak with a wind speed of 180 miles per hour and a pressure of 897 millibars. It did only make landfall as a Category 1, however, but it still had a pressure of 948 millibars, and it brought a substantial storm surge, and flooding was a major problem from this storm, which caused a lot of damage. Additionally, 599 were killed by this storm as well, and 2,500 were injured. It also delivered a lot of rain in its own right, 507 millimeters in total, and the damage from the storm amounted to 500,000 buildings being damaged and 86,000 destroyed. A very impressive storm that we didn't get to see on satellite, of course, being before that era. That's Typhoon Tess in 1953, number 49 on my top 100. Port Fourchon, Louisiana, August 2021.
Hurricane Ida was one of the most devastating storms that we've seen
seen and started off in the Caribbean Sea like any other storm, and then it intensified into a Category 1 hurricane as it struck Cuba. Now that landfall didn't really do that much to the system, but afterward, as it entered the Gulf of Mexico, it started to very rapidly intensify. And in the end, it struck Louisiana as a 150 mile per hour hurricane on August 29th, 2021, which is interestingly the same day that Katrina struck Louisiana in 2005, and Ida was the most intense hurricane it is tied as the strongest hurricane to hit this state. It is tied with the 1856 Atlantic Islands hurricane and Hurricane Laura of the year before. And now the damage it did in Louisiana was pretty astonishing, to say the least, as you can expect from any other storm. But what was even more astonishing was for what it did after its landfall. Because as it moved inland, it actually moved over the northeastern United States, and it just dropped a ton of rainfall across the area. Historic flooding in New Jersey, New York City, Pennsylvania, all these regions.
Peaking with winds of 150 miles per hour and an estimated pressure of 929 millibars at peak, Ida was a very strong storm, but also destructive when it caused at least $47 billion in damages, killed at least 47 and injured 153. The maximum rainfall from this storm totaled nearly 10 inches. Ida, number 48 in my top 100. Shimoda, Japan. October 2019.
Typhoon Hagibis, also known as the Reiwa 1 East Japan Typhoon, was the strongest storm in 2019, at least in terms of the global storm that year. At peak intensity, Hagibis was a monstrous storm on October the 7th, but it first began in the first few days of October as Tropical Depression 20W east of the Mariana Islands. Shortly after becoming a tropical depression, the system underwent a period of some intensification phase and became a tropical storm and was named Hagibis later on that day on October the 5th. Shortly after being named, Hagibis started an extremely rapid intensification phase under wind shear, which was virtually near nil, and seas temperatures of an extreme warmth. And as such, Hagibis became a typhoon, and 24 hours after becoming a typhoon, reaches peak intensity as likely with winds of force routine analysis of 190 miles per hour and a JMA reported pressure of 915 millibars, although that pressure is very likely on the high end of things, as Hagibis was an extremely, extremely powerful storm at peak.
It's a remarkable pinhole eye appearance, about to move through those islands. Eye temperature up to around 18 degrees Celsius and a huge eye wall all around that eye with a great structure.
When it plowed over on Enatahan in the northern Mariana Islands as a extremely powerful Category 5 typhoon, luckily that island was completely uninhabited, and it ultimately weakened due to its very pinhole eye, which was very... I remember personally tracking the storm. It was very related to Hurricane Wilma. It was very stable at first, but then it became very unstable, as normal pinhole eyes do in a normal replacement cycle. And it ultimately regained Category 5 status for a day or so, and then peaking with winds probably around 175 miles per hour as it moved off towards the north, but would weaken under unfavorable conditions as it approached Japan. Either way, when it ended up making landfall on October the 12th, it still had winds probably around 100 miles per hour, if not higher, when it made landfall, and would cause a massive impact in Japan. On top of a tornado that was also associated with Hagibis just before the storm made landfall, and a magnitude 5.7 earthquake, the residents of Japan were not having a swell time with Hagibis at all. And when all was said and done, Hagibis ended up causing $17.9 billion US dollars in damages, which is the costliest typhoon ever recorded when unadjusted for inflation, and also causing around 121 fatalities officially. Personally, what I remember about Hagibis is in the last few days of September into early October, I remember looking at the computer models with some of the other Forza team members, and it was very dire situation that we were looking at, because to see the computer models forecasting a typhoon with a pressure at or below 900 millibars on the computer models, and this was back whenever it was before it was even an invest or before it was even a thing. To see that, I knew that we were in for something big, and big we certainly got. And it's interesting to see that sometimes the computer models can nail storms like this, and sometimes they just can't. So that's Typhoon Hagibis back in 2019. What a storm at peak.
Kolkata, India, May 2020. A tropical disturbance first formed over the Andaman Islands and then entered the Bay of Bengal proper in the middle of May 2020 and eventually became a tropical cyclone. It was well anticipated. It became Cyclone Amphan and strengthened rapidly once it got to cyclone status and got to Category 5 status as it approached the coastline of India, weakening only a little bit whilst making a Category 2 landfall in West Bengal, moving probably pretty much directly over Kolkata and then inland.
Cyclone Amphan was not a fun experience to be in. The storm just came on May the 20th and just swept across Bakhali and the Sagar Islands and my city, where I believe the eye passed 15 miles or nautical miles, very close to the city center. I was in Alipur at the time, and I was preparing for my final exams. So the winds were gusting pretty fast, and quite a few banyan trees behind the locality. Unfortunately, I can't show them because I'm in college now. They were very badly uprooted. The city's most famous monument, Victoria Memorial, had its famous wind vane at the top blown off after around 100 plus years of standing there. And I believe a few friends of mine later told me that the weather station in Alipur recorded a 120 mile an hour gust, which is kind of insane, really insane. Definitely one of the worst experiences I've had in a long time, and it only strengthened my belief towards tracking cyclones.
Amphan was a very intense storm at peak with winds of 160 miles per hour and a pressure of 904 millibars, but its damages were even more immense. 113 were killed, $13.7 billion in damages from this storm, and 1.2 million buildings were damaged, 82,000 destroyed. It also triggered one of the largest evacuations in the basin, 4.2 million relocating to safer areas. It also caused a lot of rainfall along with its 16-foot storm surge, 385 millimeters being the maximum. Amphan, a very frightful storm, at number 46 in my top 100. Maningrida, Australia, April 2006.
The 2006 cyclone season in Australia was dominated by one storm, and that storm being Monica. Very likely in excess of 180 mile per hour peak the storm boasted, with an exquisite radar structure, the best radar structure that I've seen on any storm in the Southern Hemisphere, possibly by a significant margin as well. Monica made landfall on the far northern areas of the Northern Territory as a basically record-breaking Category 5 strength storm, making full advantage of the conditions that it had available, 30 degrees Celsius sea temperatures, very little wind shear, and a perfect and highly favorable environment for it to rapidly and even at times explosively intensify. You could think of Monica as basically a massive tornado or waterspout. The thing just went through and completely bulldozed far northern territory. Trees were just toppled like toothpicks. It was an absolute war zone after Monica blew through, and the damage was unparalleled. And thankfully, the saving grace was Monica impacted an area where basically 0 people live. So there were very minimal damages and injuries, and I believe no fatalities from the system. But it's certainly one for the record books and one for the history books, based solely off its satellite appearance and radar appearance, which is unparalleled for Australian cyclones and indeed Southern Hemisphere cyclones as well.
Our estimates for Monica put it at a peak of 185 miles per hour and a central pressure estimate of 897 millibars, one of the most intense storms in the Southern Hemisphere. It made landfall near that intensity at 175 miles per hour. Damages, as mentioned, were fairly light because it was such a sparsely populated area, but rainfall amounts topped 800 millimeters in the Australian top end. Monica, number 45 on my top 100. Pedernales, Dominican Republic, September 1966. A tropical disturbance formed in the eastern Atlantic, a tropical wave which continued west-northwestwards and eventually became Tropical Storm Inez. It continued westwards, eventually reaching the Lesser Antilles and severely impacting Guadeloupe as it made landfall as a Category 3. Inez continued to intensify and reached Category 5 status before making landfall on Hispaniola and then sweeping through Haiti and Cuba and then starting to recurve towards the northeast, weakening to a tropical storm. But then it decided to have a change of heart and turned right around through the Florida Keys and back over the Gulf of Mexico, strengthening again, and then continued towards the Yucatan Peninsula, which thought they were clear of the storm. It grazed the northern coast and then strengthened again, reaching another Category 4 peak in the western Gulf of Mexico, and eventually made landfall in Tamaulipas and then moved inland, where the storm eventually died off. Well, if the track looks weird to you, it definitely was. An extremely strange track for a storm that made impacts to as many countries as it could possibly reach, clearly. Only in recent years has it been upgraded to Category 5 at its peak intensity, with winds of 165 miles per hour and a pressure of 926 just before it slammed into the Dominican Republic. However, it was Haiti that saw the worst impacts from the storm, with potentially 1,000 killed. In total, the death toll was 1,269 in all locations, and an immense amount of damage also occurred. 18,000 buildings damaged, 21,000 destroyed, and 1,600 injured. In monetary stakes, it amounted to $226 million, a $250 million there, which is quite a way off $1 billion Betsy the year before. That was the first storm to reach the $1 billion threshold, and that was mainly because of the poorer countries that Inez was affecting. However, in real terms, the damages were still quite significant. Also, the rainfall totaled 363 millimeters from this storm in some locations and caused extremely powerful winds, of course, with wind gusts of up to 140 miles per hour in Cuba. Inez, a very memorable storm, I should say, at number 44 in my top 100. Manila, Philippines, October 1978.
Typhoon Rita, known in the Philippines as Typhoon Kating, was one of the most intense tropical cyclones ever recorded, an underestimated one if you ask me. It occurred in mid to late October in 1978 and began its track in mid-October on October 17th as a tropical depression way out in the eastern part of the Atlantic Basin. After struggling to intensify for about 24 hours or so, it then began to intensify under favorable conditions and became Tropical Storm Rita as it moved west towards Guam. As it was out in the middle of nowhere, Rita was really unimposed for a lot of its life, and after becoming a tropical storm, began to significantly intensify, becoming a typhoon a day or so later after becoming a tropical storm. It then intensified gradually for a little bit, and after becoming a Category 5 typhoon along its track to the southeast of Guam, Rita then began to rapidly intensify and probably reach its first peak with a pressure of 880 millibars. Of course, we don't really know what the wind speed was in this first peak, but it is remarkable to note that the storm would maintain a pressure below 900 millibars, really starting from just before this 880 millibar recon reading for the better part of 3 days along its track, which is a worldwide record for the longest below 900 millibars. After undergoing a narrow operational cycle, as Rita then neared the Philippines, it would rapidly intensify to probably its ultimate peak, with an astounding pressure of 878 millibars and a probable winds of at least 185 miles per hour, although some estimates go as high as 205 miles per hour, so it really could be anywhere within that range. Rita would then begin to weaken under unfavorable conditions, finally, after maintaining Category 5 status for almost 5 days, believe it or not, and would end up making landfall in the Philippines as a catastrophic Category 5 typhoon, causing at least 300 fatalities and $100 million in damages as it made that Category 5 landfall, low in Category 5, thankfully, in the portions of southern Luzon. Once the storm passed over Luzon, its circulation and the overall structure of the storm was torn to absolute shreds by the mountainous areas of Luzon, and weakened from a Category 5 to a tropical storm in around 12 hours. That really reminds me of how fast Typhoon Goni in 2020 weakened. It weakened not as fast as Rita did, but it weakened pretty fast, and just shows you that tropical cyclone is going to be utterly destroyed by these mountainous terrains. Rita then limped on and kind of didn't and did at the same time make it to Vietnam. I believe it was tropical depression whenever it got there, but it sort of limped on towards Vietnam as a very weakening system. Luckily, did not really cause much impacts there.
Flooding turned out to be a massive issue from the storm after it made landfall. In total, there were 724 killed by it. $138 million in damages at least, but the damages in terms of structures damaged and destroyed don't really tell the big picture. 241,000 buildings damaged and 50,000 destroyed by this storm. An incredible, powerful typhoon, and certainly one to remember. Typhoon Rita, with its extraordinary peak and the amount of time it kept that peak going for, is number 43 in my top 100. Dinagat Island, Philippines, November 1990. A tropical disturbance eventually formed over the Micronesian islands and cruised through the western Pacific in the early days of November, becoming Typhoon Mike. This storm would then explosively intensify near Palau, peaking as a strong Category 5 storm as it approached the Philippines and started to weaken only a little bit before making landfall and then moving through the Visayas region and through Palawan and then into the South China Sea. Strengthening back to Category 2 status after weakening, it then weakened again and eventually turned northwards through Hainan and died out very close to the coast of Vietnam. So Mike was not just a Category 5 typhoon, it was an extremely powerful storm with an estimated peak wind speed of 205 miles per hour and a pressure of 874 millibars. It's unfortunate that Recon was suspended 3 years prior by the JTWC. They stopped using recon planes in these storms, otherwise we'd have got a much better indication of how strong Mike actually was. At this point, we were just using satellite estimates to determine the storm's winds. But it did make landfall as a Category 4 with 140 mile per hour winds and was devastating to the central Philippines. It killed 822, damaged 631,000 buildings and destroyed 222,000, resulting in at least $391 million in damages. It was also a fairly wet storm. 250 millimeters was the maximum. That was probably going to be much higher if the storm was moving through the islands slower, but as it was, Mike moved through the Philippines relatively quickly, and the rainfall wasn't the worst aspect. It was the strong winds from this storm, although flooding also happened in the Philippines. Mike, an extremely powerful storm, memorable and very photogenic, number 42 in my top 100. Camagüey, Cuba, November 1932. a late-season tropical cyclone formed in the central Atlantic and became a tropical storm after moving through the Leeward Islands. It then eventually went on to become a hurricane, getting to a low latitude off Colombia and strengthening gradually but ferociously towards a Category 5 peak intensity as it moved towards the central and western Caribbean, which was still certainly warm enough at this time of year. It then moved northwards, passing the Cayman Islands, and then made landfall in Cuba as a strong Category 4 storm, making landfall with winds of 150 miles per hour and an estimated pressure of 918 millibars. It then pushed on through northeastwards, passing by Bermuda, and eventually turned post-tropical as it got closer to the Azores. This hurricane was absolutely ferocious. Even though it didn't have a name, it certainly will be remembered for the ages. An extremely powerful storm with at least 175 mph winds at peak and a pressure of 915 millibars. That pressure reading occurred around 13 miles from the center of the storm at least, so it was probably much stronger. In Cuba, a small town on the southern coast where the storm made landfall, Santa Cruz del Sur, was completely obliterated, killing nearly 3,000 in that village or town alone. In total across Cuba and everywhere else that the storm struck, we saw a total of 3,103 fatalities, immense. Damages, we're not really sure on the exact state of the damages, but the injury toll also rose to 3,600 as the 21-foot storm surge rolled in from the Caribbean Sea. Extremely powerful Cuba hurricane of 1932, and is the strongest November hurricane in the Atlantic as well. Whether you regard Iota as a Category 5 or not, that's the only other company it shares. In November, that was Hurricane 14 of 1932, number 41 in my top 100.